Hello, viewers. Welcome to this second episode of ours on Omicron. That's the thing that everyone's talking about these days. You remember when the pandemic started in India in 2020, it was about COVID and Corona. And then last year was a devastating Delta wave. And then towards the end of 2021 and beginning of 2022, we are now only talking about Omicron. So one of the things you have to understand is that, you know, not all is known. It's like learning on the job for doctors also. Sometimes patients and public expects the doctors to have all the answers. So they have an all or none approach that you guys don't know anything or you should have all the answers. But the truth is, in a virus that is mutating so fast, a pandemic of the kind that no one has faced in the past, it is obvious that we learn on the job which treatments work, which don't work. You need good studies. Normally, you would take, months to do such a study, publish it carefully. Now, everything's being done in fast forward mode. So, therefore, there is a important point that we need to understand before we go into the discussion today, that this is a rapidly changing field. There are very few dogmatic statements that we can make. We can only apprise you of the current state of knowledge and how you, as public, as patients, how should you deal with this? And that's going to be the goal today. And sometimes these recommendations do change as you learn more about the virus or the mutation. So we have to be aware of that fact, and we have to always understand that what we are trying to do is actually give you the best information, give you the best care possible, the best advice you should get. You can also discuss with your doctor whatever is being discussed. So in the last episode, we discussed the science of Omicron. We had a detailed exposition on that, about how it has mutated, it has become a virus like that. Today, we have three eminent clinicians for you. By clinicians, we mean people who treat patients day in and day out. And I'm joined in this program by Dr. Sandeep Budiraja, who is the Chief of Internal Medicine at Max Healthcare, Saket, by Dr. Suranjit Chatterjee, who is Senior Consultant, well-known internal medicine specialist at the Indraprastha Apollo Hospital in Delhi, and by Dr. Manish Suneja, who is an additional professor at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. So we're bringing you people from three different hospitals to give you a different flavor of how we have managed this, or how they have managed this pandemic so far. So let's first talk about your experience with the first and second waves before we move to Omicron per se. Sandeep, what's been your experience with the first and second waves? What's the difference? And then we'll come to the specifics of the third wave.
So I think, as you rightly said, first wave beginning was essentially all about learning and trying to understand what this virus is all about, setting up processes, infrastructure. In fact, policies from the government have been very, very dynamic and constantly changing. And that speed of change was very, very fast initially, right from the day one, when the first advisory was to admit anybody who comes positive with COVID. So essentially, the hospitals initially got filled. I'm talking about starting with the first wave, with very mild cases, many times asymptomatic cases who needed to be kept for 14 days. And gradually, as the awareness of disease increased and we sort of gained confidence that these patients can be managed at home, obviously, there was a shift towards then only admitting moderate and severe patients. So essentially, to cut the long story short, wave one was essentially the entire period of 2020. Wave two was that few months of 2021, April, May, June, when we know there was a chaos. And now the third wave, which just started December end. And each of the three waves characteristically happened by different strains. So the first one, the original Wuhan strain, towards the end of first wave, it was the Alpha, which again contributed to slight surge in the tail of the first wave. And then second wave, of course, we all know Delta, and third wave is Omicron. The characteristics of the patients, in Max Healthcare, we have sort of admitted over this 2 years period about 35,000 patients, 20,000 odd in the first wave and about 12 to 13,000 in the second wave. What we have seen is the mortality rates definitely in the second wave were higher, about 10% with us admitted patients, which was about 7 to 8% in wave one. We did have a slightly younger population in second wave as compared to the elderlies in wave 2. Although I remember vaccination drive had started when the second wave happened, but still majority of population was either unvaccinated or under-vaccinated. So they did not get protection against Delta. There was a very high oxygen requirement, very high ventilator requirement, and very large number of patients developed secondary infections. And we do remember what happened is with this black fungus mucormycosis. All that caused devastation in the second wave. Third wave, if you ask, I think we'll come to third wave subsequently, but I can tell you the mortality was very high. The oxygen requirement was as high as 70 to 80% in the second wave, predominantly because of the serious Delta strain.
So I think everyone had similar experiences. And let me just point out to all three of you something that is very obvious to us. And sometimes public or people don't understand this aspect. The first is that when we started out, we always thought the transmission was, a lot of it was fomite transmission, right? Remember the days when everything was sanitized and everything that was delivered was cleaned and, kept outside and all those things. As the first wave came to an end, we realized that fomite transmission was really not important, right? So I think that is a huge change because that took away a lot of anxiety from doctors, at least because we were constantly struggling first with the mask and the PPE, but also about touching anything. So it is still important, of course, to wash hands, but we realized that the main mode of transmission is not through fomites. That is one thing that changed very significantly, after the first wave was in progress. The second, of course, was we don't realize, we talk of RT-PCR and how much time it takes. We don't realize what RT-PCR facilities we had at the beginning of the first wave. And it is quite spectacular the way the facilities have been increased across the country. And everyone knows RT-PCR, and every nook and corner of this country, you can get RT-PCR tests done. So I think those are huge things. And there are further advances as we reach the third wave. So I think these are some of the important points, like PPE. We didn't know initially how to get PPEs. There was a crisis there. And then soon India was exporting PPEs. So a lot of work has gone in the first wave itself to make us more equipped. But the Delta, of course, was a devastating wave that took many lives and harmed many of us, our patients, and even our colleagues. So can I come back to you, Dr. Suneja? What is this Omicron variant that has come about? We know that viruses mutate. We know they come back in different forms. The SARS-CoV-2 virus also has mutated. So suddenly we are talking, it's only last 1 month, we are talking only about Omicron. You want to tell us something about that?
Yeah, it's really hit us like a bolt from the blue. Towards the fag end of the year, we were really comfortable seeing that the Delta wave was past us. We had a naturally immune population. We had a very good rate of vaccination. So we were relatively comfortable. But suddenly the virus decides to hand over the baton. The Delta hands over the baton to this new variant, Omicron, which has decided to just change its clothes, basically. It has changed its clothes. It has become more sticky. It has become more transmissible because of certain mutations on its spike proteins. Also, there are certain features on its clothes which helped our body, the antibodies, whether it was due to natural infection or due to a vaccine, to identify and neutralize the virus. That has also changed. So theoretically, what hit us in the month of late November, December was that, so we have a new virus which is likely to be more transmissible, cause more infection, and which is also likely to be immune invasive. That means it may also likely to cause severe disease, and our vaccines, our monoclonal antibodies may not work that well. Fast forward a couple of weeks, we had some data coming from Hong Kong, and then subsequently 5 more groups have given the same picture. That is, the virus multiplies very fast in the upper airways, the bronchus, 70 times faster than Delta. That means there's a very high viral load in the upper airways. That makes transmissibility very high. Even it overcomes the antibody potential to stop the disease. Secondly, the virus multiplies 10-fold lesser in the lower airways, that is the alveoli, giving the body more time to act against it. So probably that may be one of the reasons why the disease is less severe. Though obviously we know that virus alone, the virus characteristics do not decide the severity of disease. It is also the host immune response. We all know of the term cytokine storm that becomes so common in the Delta wave. So high transmissibility, immune evasive potential, and implications for disease severity. These are the three things which have hit us with this new variant of the virus.
Thank you, Dr. Suneja. Basically, what has happened that the virus has mutated, as you said, and because of the mutation, the transmissibility, replication is high. There are certain structural changes in the virus that allow it to bind to the receptor better, and etc. We discussed that last time. Mainly, it transmits faster. There's no question about that. It largely grows in the upper airways. In the nose, pharynx, upper airways, not so much in the lungs. Perhaps if someone was infected for long, it would probably grow in the lung also. And because it's largely in the upper airway, before it moves down, it gives time to the body to respond to it, as Manish pointed out. We don't know about the severity, but we'll come to that. The important part here is that it's also a different population. One thing you mentioned, Manish, was that it's a population that is elderly, and the comorbid conditions, they are the ones who get affected much more. That is true for every virus. But in particular, it's a different population because, as you pointed out, people have been vaccinated. Number one, a lot of people have been vaccinated. And secondly, a lot of people have been infected with Delta. Okay, so we've had 2 rounds of infection plus vaccination. So the virus is not attacking a naive population. It's a different population now. And therefore, the properties will also change. What are the clinical features, Sandeep, that you noticed in this round that you've noticed so far? We only a couple of weeks experience.
Yeah. So, if you ask me whether on clinical symptoms basis alone, can we differentiate between Delta and Omicron, the answer would be no. But yes, there are certain characteristics and certain differences all of us as physicians have noticed in patients suffering from Omicron. First of all, classically, what we used to talk about, loss of sense of smell and taste, which was classically associated with the earlier strains, we don't see that happening with Omicron with that frequency. Secondly, as has been said, the disease is mild. But if you ask a person who's down with Omicron, he has one sentence to say. Dr. Saab, you keep saying it is mild, mild, mild. Media is saying mild, mild, mild. But I am really suffering a lot. And what they are suffering from is basically high-grade fever with chills and rigors, severe body aches and headache. Now, this is something which was to this degree not seen with the previous 2 strains or previous 3 strains. We used to have fever 100, 101. Here we are seeing fever up to 102, 3, 4. And sometimes I have had a patient who's 105 and extreme chills and rigors. But interestingly, this is short-lasting. So the entire duration of illness is about 3 to 5 days. About 3rd day onwards, the patient suddenly starts feeling much better. That's as far as the fever is concerned. Then a scratchy throat, a sort of a dry cough. But as has been rightly said, predominantly a disease affecting the upper airways. So person may also complain of cold, stuffy and blocked nose. But very few people complaining of breathing difficulty, chest tightness, chest pain, shortness of breath, or their oxygen levels going down. That we don't see happening very often. So these are the 2 broad characteristics and sometimes when there is a cohort, now we know, and every country, every city, every district has gone through a phenomena where this 3rd wave started with a dual infection. That means there were Delta cases and there were Omicron cases. And every week that percentage changed. So starting in India also, first week of wave 3, it was 60% Delta. Then it became 40%. Then now it becomes 20%. And I'm sure coming a few weeks, we'll see it as 100% Omicron. Yeah. So that's something which we are seeing happening all over the world with with almost similarity in the pattern.
Well, we'll take a short break now and be back with more information, all the clinical aspects of Omicron.
expectations ahead of the upcoming union budget and the road ahead in the next financial year is what we will look at on the show today.
The last 10 years, 2011-12 base industrial production for manufacturing. So in the manufacturing sector, there is about 2% annualized rate of growth.
I would suggest is our dependency on electric vehicle is very much on China. We are only a crisis managers. We don't foresee what is need to be done in the future.
It's a 40% increase that the defense budget has seen towards Indian industry allocation.
Watch our special telecast, Budget for India, tonight at 8 p.m. on Sunset TV.
Thank you, gentlemen. Welcome after the break, and thank you for giving such important information out to our viewers. Dr. Chatterjee, who are the patients who are reaching the hospital now? Now the admission criteria have changed, hospitalization criteria have changed. We do realize that Omicron infections, while they are not serious in that sense so far, in terms of life-threatening serious, but they do cause significant symptoms and morbidity. So who are the people who are getting hospitalized now?
Just first, let me begin to let me add a few things to what Sandeep said. I would totally agree that the main symptom that the patients are complaining of is basically a high-grade fever, moderate to high-grade fever, a sore throat or a scratchy throat, a lot of body ache, headache, and weakness. As Sandeep said, I think that there's still a mixture of infections that is happening, there's Delta and Omicron that is happening in this city, at least in Delhi till now, because the first statement that Sandeep said that we are not seeing patients who have complained of loss of taste and smell. Unfortunately, at least in the last 4 days, I have come across at least about 8 patients who have complained of the same thing to me. So I still think that there is a mixture happening, and I'm very sure that Omicron will take over and this symptom might just disappear. But I would just keep a watch on this symptom as to what is this happening over here. A few people also have complained of loose motions and nausea and decreased appetite, which is again not a very common symptom of Omicron, which has been reported worldwide. So these two symptoms I need to keep a watch on. Now, coming to your question that you asked as to which type of patients are really coming to the hospital. Most of the patients, as Sandeep said, are settling down in about 3 to 5 days' time. And there's a dramatic response. In 3 days' time, the throat pain reduces, the fever reduces. They continue to have a bit of cough and weakness and all these things, but the main symptom reduces and they feel very fine. But who are coming to the hospital are people with comorbidities, people who have had basically who are known asthmatics, or who have bronchitis, or who have cardiac issues, who have heart failure, or who have received chemotherapy, cancer patients. They are the patients who are coming to the hospital, and a few of them have to be really admitted to the hospital. Very few till now. As if we compare with the Delta variant and with that wave, the number of admissions is minuscule. But yes, this is the group of patient and elderly population, more than 60, with all this vulnerability and comorbidities who are requiring admission to a hospital setting.
It's also early days yet. We don't know. It's only 2 weeks experience, I think, that we have with this strain so far. So, Dr. Suneja, one of the things that is being seen is that people are hospitalized for other things. And because COVID testing is mandatory in most hospitals now, you get hospitalized for something else and you're found to be COVID positive. So, should these people be regarded as affected by COVID, and if the outcome that is determined by COVID, or should they be just called incidental cases? How would you deal with that, Manish?
So hospitals are hotspots. So we have seen even during the previous waves, the first it starts with the hospital. Patients are coming to the hospitals, COVID patients, and then there are patients who are coming for their other ailments, which are predominantly patients who are elderly or have some comorbidities, heart disease, diabetes, etc. There also tends to be a nosocomial transmission in the hospital. So we are also, till now, whatever we have seen, most of the patients are who had come from some other reason for getting treatment. When tested, they are found to be COVID positive, and most of them we are sending back for home isolation as per guidelines released by the Ministry of Health. So most of these are incidental COVID, I would say, rather than symptoms of COVID bringing them.
Right. So when we analyze data, that's always a challenge. When data is analyzed, should these patients, supposing someone comes with a stroke or a massive MI, heart attack, and succumbs actually, and is also found to be COVID positive, it's quite a challenge for physicians to decide whether COVID was just incidental or did not play a role, or should we go by just hard statistics and say that everyone who is COVID positive is a COVID outcome. We should count them in the COVID outcome. What do you feel about that, Manish?
So yes, most of these, though they have to be classified as COVID because they had COVID, so patient of stroke, trauma, they are polytrauma, they have poor outcome because of the primary disease. But since they have incidental COVID detected on diagnosis, but as per rules, yes, any patient at the time of death having COVID positivity just prior to that, we have to keep the COVID diagnosis in the outcome also.
It's also possible that COVID did play a role in their worse outcome, which you don't understand yet. It's
Yes,
also
it may,
possible.
may.
It's very difficult to sift out clearly, right? So, I will put in my 2-penny bit here, and the main difference that we are seeing, the first two waves, we were inundated with calls from Sandeep's team and others about managing diabetes. And the sugars were just all over the place. And everyone knew that there is a big connection between COVID-19 and diabetes. And people with diabetes had worse outcomes. And we've shown that, published that also. In fact, almost 53% of the people hospitalized had some degree of dysglycemia, some degree of glucose abnormality. So that is huge, and that impacted the outcome very significantly, consistently across the world in numerous studies, along with other comorbidities, of course, not just diabetes, but hypertension, heart disease, kidney disease, all those are there. But the truth is that if you ask me, in so many years of experience, the last 2 years, the COVID waves the diabetes has been the hardest to manage. I have not had so much difficulty in managing blood sugar as I have had in the last 2 years, despite the full team being on the job. And, everyone, we've seen the data from AIIMS and discussed with colleagues in AIIMS and Apollo and everywhere. So that has been a big challenge. It does not look like we are going to reach that stage quickly in the third wave or the Omicron wave. It does look like we are not getting those number of calls. Steroids are not being used, obviously, because lung inflammation is not a major factor so far. And therefore, or maybe the severity of infection is also different, because severe hyperglycemia of the kind we saw in the first two waves, we are not seeing this time around. I think that's also a reflection of the nature of the virus or the severity of the infection. So I'll come back to you, Sandeep, and talk to you about diagnosis. That has also changed a little bit. It's become a little easier. There are other tools available. So what tests are used for diagnosis now in 2022?
So I think the entire world now knows the word RT-PCR, which till date, I think 2 years back, some doctors also probably would find it difficult to really expand that. So yeah, that still remains the gold standard. We have a acid-based nucleic acid test called CBNAT, which is a similar test, but it is a individual test. So the turnaround time is much faster. But here what we do is we amplify the viral RNA to reach a critical threshold, after which it can then be detected by the methods. So that's what RT-PCR is. And the conventional RT-PCR in most of the labs now has a turnaround time of anywhere between 12 hours or 24 hours, depending upon the load. It can be even 6 to 8 hours. So that remains the gold standard. CBNAT is, I'll put it in the same category. But I think what has completely changed the diagnostics is not the RT-PCR. Of course, now a lot of labs are doing it. We have DSL 3 and 2 and 3 safety labs. the network has widened, but actually it is the rapid antigen test, which I think has made the access to diagnosis because of its because of its cost, I mean, and because of the turnaround time of just about few minutes, 15 minutes, and the ease and convenience of doing the test. In fact, now in India, if we're talking about, in the last few months itself, almost 145 companies are making, or there are 145 types, brands of, or companies manufacturing this rapid antigen test, which are now ICMR approved. 30 of these have had revalidation done. And you can go to a chemist, purchase it for what, about 200 rupees or so, bring it and do the test yourself. And just like you do a simple pregnancy test, you put it in your nose, put it in a liquid, and then put that drop on the thing. And if you get 2 lines, it's positive, just akin to pregnancy test. It is that simple. And simply, even in the hospitals, when you enter into the emergencies, this is something which is done as a screening test for most of the patients. And now, in fact, in our hospitals, we have also started the policy of even one attendant who will stay with the patient should also ideally do the test, because he or she can also bring the infection in. So cheap tests, rapid tests, convenient tests, self-doable tests. Now, they detect the protein or the antigen on the surface of the virus. And they can only detect if it is a highly reproducible virus. So that means it is a very fast reproducing or growing virus. That's the reason why rapid antigen tests have gained popularity with Omicron, and they had not become so popular with Delta, because Delta, the false negativity rate was very high. Whereas with Omicron, because the colonization and the growth and the reproduction happens in the upper airways, and it's a very rapidly reproducing virus, you are able to pick it up easily by rapid antigen test. And you don't really need to go to RT-PCR. The problem happens, there are still cases of false negative happening even after rapid antigen test, and that may actually happen with RT-PCR also. So the golden diktat still remains that if a person is symptomatic, or if a person has had a close exposure or a high risk exposure to a positive person, and you are testing negative by either of the tests, please still isolate yourself and redo these tests maybe 24 or 48 hours later. The other interesting part of the antigen test is that the moment you have had an exposure, a high risk exposure with somebody who was confirmed positive, you can actually do the self-test next day onwards. And there have been incidents where you can easily detect it even in the first day, although normally it is said it's the 4th or the 5th day of exposure when you need to do this test. So the quarantine policies, the isolation policies have now reduced from 14 days to 10 days to 7 days. In India, 7 days, you can just join back. In UK, they say you 7 days, you do the rapid antigen test yourself twice, negative, join back. CDC says 5 days. So all that has become because of the tests becoming more accessible. But the problem is that rapid antigen test in India is still being underreported. So there's no mandate that you report it to government officials, whereas RT-PCR is connected through a lab, through your Aadhaar card, and gets directly reported. And then somebody from the magistrate's or DM's office will call you, and there will be daily monitoring. Rapid antigen test reporting remains still based on individual. And that's the reason why we are seeing this degree of discordance data. The number of people actually positive, maybe many fold of what is being reported. One reason could be this. But at least the people are diagnosing themselves and isolating themselves and not spreading the infection.
I think the convenience is remarkable. But there are challenges, Dr. Chatterjee, right, with these tests. The challenges are that, as Sandeep said, that there are so many varieties. We should really be having a grid where it says sensitivity, specificity of each of these kits, which is documented and like it is done for other things. So that kind of data, so that people can compare, because soon you will have RT-PCR kits which are probably not validated, not approved by ICMR, but people will not know the difference. I'm talking of not RT-PCR, rapid antigen kits. And, that will be another challenge I foresee in this country, because people quickly latch on to these kind of things. So I think quality control of RT-PCR and of course of rapid antigen tests is actually very, very important. And we should not lose sight of that right now, as we are seeing greater use and greater accuracy of these tests. What do you want to say to that, Dr. Chatterjee?
I would totally agree with you that there's a need to really standardize these products. If we don't standardize them, and so many companies making it, then there could be a false positive, false negative. All these reports can be haywire, and the numbers could be, and we might be spreading the infection much more. So we need to have a grid which tells us that, okay, this is the sensitivity, this is the specificity of this test of all the kits that are being manufactured in the country. It is very convenient. It has really is a game changer this time because so many people are testing positive with this. Last time when we used to get this test done, there was a huge number of people who were false negative. But as Sandeep said, this time we are, because of the proliferation of the virus, we can find this test to be positive in quite a few patients and can become the way to diagnose this disease. That's very important. But as Sandeep said, that it is very important that there has to be a reporting mechanism. The government and or some health authority needs to be informed about the positivity of the patient, because that is not happening. And that's the reason why the number of cases that are being reported in this city or in the country is less as compared to the number of people who are actually suffering. So there are two things that we need to really standardize the kits so that we know that how sensitive or specific it is. And we also need to mandate that the people who turn out to be positive should somehow inform the public health department or the government in some way.
Thank you, Dr. Chatterjee. I'm going back to Dr. Suneja, and we talked about the diagnostic tests, and we remember that in the last time around we did a lot of tests for our patients. There were a lot of emphasis on inflammatory markers that began rising sometime later in the course of disease. There were a lot of HRCTs. Everything was happening. Where do you put the other testing, which is very, very important because this is just a diagnosis? So I want to know what is your opinion about doing supportive or other tests to decide treatment for this condition?
Put that just a point regarding rapid tests. So rapid tests, they were approved last year by ICMR. So there were paucity of kits, let us understand. So any kit which had sensitivity, specificity above 50% were approved. So maybe now we have better quality kits available and that those things can be revisited. Probably that is what the feeling of the experts is, I understand. Regarding tests, yes, other tests, we were inundated with 20-page reports of parameters, CT scan done on day 3, day 7, day 10, and all these coming in WhatsApp. It was really a difficult job to see all of those reports and try to convince the patient that we are going to treat the symptoms, not the reports. Let's face the fact, we don't really know what report above which level of CRP are we supposed to treat. If a patient has no symptoms, even if D-dimer is 2 times the upper limit, if the patient has no symptoms, we are obviously not going to treat the patient. And even after 1.5 years of research, there is no solid evidence to help treatment based on cutoff levels in these blood tests. So the national guidelines, as it has come out on 5th of January on home isolation, we encourage the patients to be patient and do not do self-tests. What option has been given so what has been discussed till now, the symptoms are going away mostly by day 3, 4. So what these guidelines says is that if the symptoms are persistent in particular high-grade fever, then you should contact your doctor. And the physician will advise based on the symptomatology. He may suspect a mixed infection, he may suspect a bacterial infection, he may prescribe an antibiotic or an NSAID. But please do not self-test. Let your doctor decide what is best for you.
Thank you. We'll again take a short break and be back for the last segment where we'll talk a little bit about treatment and what should our viewers do if they are tested positive.
India has grown at rapid rates when exports have grown. We are seeing India achieving record levels of export this year.
There will continue to be a strong rally insofar as international trade is concerned. One part of the driver of the rally is going to be economic factor.
Finally, it's about skills. If we are able to get skill and scale, there is no doubt that with skills and the economies of scale, we'll be the most competitive in the world.
Essentially, we can divide the supply chain into 3 aspects. The first one is, out of the total consumption which happens in the country, how much of that are we manufacturing within the country? The second perspective is, how much of that is backward integrated? And the third question is, are we competitive on a global scale?
Welcome to the third segment of this very interesting program where we are discussing clinical aspects of the Omicron wave. We'll quickly go over treatment plans. Treatment plans are decided by doctors. Really, you should trust your doctor for that. But just to put things in perspective, we know that the primary treatment of symptoms is the main treatment actually right now. So symptomatic relief in terms of use of paracetamol and other drugs or antihistamines for your cough and cold, as you would do in any other viral, right? There is hardly any role of using antibiotics, which people often use right from day one, and that's completely not recommended, except in people who are developing secondary infection. We have reason to suspect. We shouldn't really be chasing. People often ask me, my patients are asking me, so why can't I start XYZ antibiotic, But there's actually no role, and we need to understand that we may be doing more harm than good by starting antibiotics early in viral infections if there is no evidence of secondary infection. But there are some specifics also, and of course, before I go ahead, I would say that the old sort of basket of HCQS and ivermectin and all those are really not in the fray anymore. They've been shown to be not effective. So those are out. So we have just 2-3 specific questions for our experts. So one is about, we all know that Paxlovid is an antiviral drug developed by Pfizer, I think, which has shown remarkable efficacy against COVID-19 in reducing hospitalization and also overall mortality, but almost 90%. But that's not available to us. But there's another drug that is available here, and that's being used, not being used. There's a lot of confusion among the public. There were some media reports about it being licensed and then so much negative reporting. So I would ask Dr. Suneja what he feels about molnupiravir, which is an antiviral drug.
So please let me explain it. It's very important. So molnupiravir has been given emergency use authorization in some countries based on a single study, obviously conducted by the maker who developed this drug. Now, what they saw, they did this in the time of Delta. They also had patients of Mu variant of the COVID. What they saw was the reduction of hospitalization and death from 10% to 7%. So it means even after taking molnupiravir, 7% of patients had a progressive disease, required hospitalization. So this reduction was from 10% to 7%. So the risk was 10%. Now, fast forward to Omicron. Omicron, this risk is as less as 1%. And this data comes from South Africa, where they have shown 5% of patients are requiring hospitalization, but there are various causes of hospitalization. Only 1% of patients are there who are requiring oxygen for COVID. So basically 1% of patients who are requiring admission for COVID, requiring oxygen. So now if the absolute risk, which was 10% at the time this study was conducted, comes down to 1% with Omicron, what is the benefit that we are going to get with molnupiravir? It is not going to make it zero. It is going to reduce it, relative reduction, to 0.7. So what that means? That means in scientific terms, number needed to treat. We need to treat 300 patients to prevent one hospitalization. So this is the reward. So whenever we are looking whether we should use a drug or not, we have to do a risk-reward analysis. So the reward is preventing one hospital admission for 300 patients. Let's say it's not 1%, it is 2%, it is 3%. Even then, we need to treat 100 patients to prevent one hospitalization. Now, what is the risk? So this is a mutagenic drug. This causes mutations. So even in laboratory studies have shown it can cause mutations in mammalian cells. So we need to be concerned because of its potential side effects. So that's why it is not recommended in pregnancy, not recommended in less than 18 years because it can affect the bones, cartilage, etc. And I don't know with this mutagenic potential, whether there's any potential of carcinogenesis or cancer as well in the future. Now, there may be arguments that this is just a 5-day treatment, may not cause, but we have to look at the risk-reward ratio. Treating hundreds of patients to prevent one hospitalization, at the same time exposing them to such a risk, I would not be very keen to it. So basically, we have to identify a subgroup of patients who have a risk of, let's say, at least 10-15% of progressing to a severe disease requiring hospitalization. Yes, it may be used, but do we really see any such subgroup with Omicron? As of current data, probably no. So probably we need to wait on it rather than, and please do not use it over the counter. Let your doctor decide whether you fit into a category where your risk is so high that a molnupiravir may have a good risk-reward ratio.
So I think those are very important points, but we also have to keep in mind that there are a lot of elderly susceptible patients where even a minor reduction in hospitalization may be very important. And of course.
Can I add here? So very interesting point. So the next point is we should identify this high-risk group. So if we see at the study closely, they have done a subgroup analysis. And there was no benefit seen in patients above the age of 60 years, those who are diabetic or had a cardiac ailment. There was no benefit seen in these patients. Benefits were seen in less than 60 years of age. So that is also something very important to note.
Right. I understand that. But I guess what we have to do, firstly, because the drug was approved just 1 week before, I think around the early part of January itself, or just in December, and it became marketed as a wonder drug or something. So we have to be very clear, it's not a wonder drug. It has significant risk, but particularly in pregnant women, those planning pregnancy, and in children. So that leaves a narrow band of people where it can be used. But we do think that people who are at higher risk of hospitalization may be good candidates for molnupiravir, although the final data on the stratification and age-related is not clearly available, only one study, as you said. So I think it's important that we use the drug judiciously and carefully. We should not perhaps go to either extreme. We should not label any drug as bad. There's so many drugs, there's so many side effects that we use. It has to be used by the doctor and carefully. It should not be just prescribed like randomly. So I think we all agree on that. Remdesivir, Dr. Chatterjee, was a big sort of story in the second round. Where is it now? There is some new data on remdesivir. Can you very briefly tell us about that?
See, remdesivir, I thought, was really misused during the second wave and where it came through, because it was not used at the right time. This is what I thought, although that was the recommendation, that use it at the time when the patient becomes hypoxic, when the patient is sick, and obviously is a hospitalized patient. But it being an antiviral drug, I thought that placing the drug in the first few days and giving it in the first few days would have made the difference. So there is a study, obviously sponsored by the manufacturer, and it has been published in NEJM, which says that if you give early remdesivir, even on an OPD basis, as an outpatient basis, they gave it for 3 days. First day they gave 200 milligrams, and the next 2 days they gave 100 milligrams. And obviously a population, or obviously a patient who has been really selected, not in anybody and everybody. All these drugs that we are talking about is to be very judiciously used. It is not that anybody uses the drug because, there have been beneficial effects which have been found. So I would suggest that once you have judiciously chosen the patient because of the risk factors, who really have the risk factor to progress to a severe disease or a serious disease requiring hospitalization, in those people, in that select group, you might think of giving remdesivir at an early stage, in the early first 3 to 5 days time itself, for a 3-day course. That's what the study says. Obviously, as days go by, more studies will come through and more experience will come through, and that will tell us. But I'm not totally anti-remdesivir at this moment. I would think that it might be used very judiciously in the first few days of the illness.
So remdesivir may be used. Of course, the problem with remdesivir is its administration, which is very difficult on an OPD basis, and then to call patients to the hospital in this environment for administering the drug is also a challenge, which is why people got attracted to the oral counterparts or the oral options like Paxlovid or molnupiravir, but Paxlovid, of course, as I said, is not available. One line comment from you, Dr. Bajaj, again, a very, very important area. Use of monoclonal antibodies, Sandeep. What do you want to say about that?
So if I want to answer that fast, it works very well for Delta. The cocktail regime, which is available in India, the Roche cocktail, works very well for Delta strains. It reduces the risk for hospitalization and severe disease by 85%. It does not work for Omicron. Now, one has to decide what's the status of prevalence of Delta and Omicron in a community and then decide. The recent guidelines from NIH US say that if the community spread of Delta is in an ongoing pandemic with Omicron, Delta is more than 20% contribution, then you may have some justification of using monoclonal antibodies. So doctor will have to use his discretion. Again, it is to be used early in the illness. It is to be used for those group of patients who are at a higher risk of going on to a severe disease with multiple comorbidities. It may be of beneficial in people who are unvaccinated status because that's a risk population for Omicron. It is expensive. It has to be done in a daycare setting in a hospital. So patient would have to come for a half an hour, 1 hour. There's a 1 hour observation period after this thing. There are no side effects really, except for allergic reactions really, which can happen. But it will only work for Delta. And by the time you do a genomic sequencing and get that answer, you are really out of that critical window by when you can give the monoclonal antibodies. So you have to sit down with the patient's family or do a teleconsult and clearly make that informed decision. We're explaining the pros and cons, the cost bit of it, and then go ahead and do it only in the right group of people with a clear understanding that it is only going to work if it is Delta. Till we at a time get a sort of a monoclonal antibody which is specific for Omicron. Glaxo has one which is Sotrovimab, which is available in US and some countries in the West, not yet available. There's another cocktail regime being made, which has been made by AstraZeneca, again not yet available, which is effective against Omicron. But I am very hopeful that in coming future these drugs will also get available in our country. But till that time, use this drug very, very cautiously after having discussed the implications and pros and cons.
So the thing is that since 90% in Delhi or Bombay are right now Omicron, so the use of monoclonal antibodies should, in general, if someone is not clear, should be generally discouraged. And as you said, if to be used, it has to be used with informed consent, with a lot of discussion with the family, because we're really not achieving that much in Omicron at all. And we don't have Sotrovimab. And as I said, we don't have the antiviral we spoke about earlier. So treatment-wise, basically, it is symptomatic treatment largely so far for Omicron. We haven't seen so many patients dropping their oxygen. The craze about oxygen all the time, it's not dropping the way it was at the time. We're not getting those frantic calls all the time about SpO2s suddenly dropped. There will be some patients who will be in that zone, but many will not. Now, there's a bit of rapid fire now. We have only about 5 minutes left. And I'll go one by one. Dr. Chatterjee, what should I do if I'm diagnosed positive?
So don't panic, isolate yourself, consult your local physician or pediatrician. That's what I would suggest. That's what is required.
How long should the isolation be?
It all depends on your symptoms. If it's a mild disease or an asymptomatic disease, then the isolation period, as government has recommended, is 7 days. But if you have persistent symptoms or the disease is moderate or severe, obviously the duration of isolation can go up to 10 to 14 days, and you might have to repeat your RT-PCR test as well in a moderate to severe case. So if it is a home isolation with mild or asymptomatic case, then the isolation period is 7 days. But what is important is that in the last 3 days of your illness, you should not be having any fever.
Absolutely. Very important points. And Sandeep, moving even further, I'm exposed to somebody. Right now, healthcare workers are all exposed to somebody who turns out next year to be positive. What should I do?
So in healthcare setting for healthcare workers, earlier recommendation was that if you have had a low or a medium risk exposure, and that means if both were masked, or at least if one was masked and the exposure was very small and maybe in aerated environment, that's a low and moderate risk exposure, you do not need to isolate yourself and you can continue to work. If you have a high-grade exposure or a severe exposure, then you need to self-isolate yourself and do the test, which is antigen or RT-PCR on the 4th or the 5th day maybe, and then negative come back if you are asymptomatic. But that guidelines also is now changed. And it said that irrespective of the level of exposure, if you remain asymptomatic, you can continue to work and only isolate yourself if you are symptomatic, or may do a test. And if test comes positive, then isolate yourself. And this sort of, I would say, has been changed, seeing the biggest crisis which is coming up in this wave, and that's extreme shortage of healthcare workers happening because of large number of doctors and nurses falling sick. That is causing a big gap in the continuity of care. So just to sort of counter that, we are making these policies much more flexible than what they were in earlier times.
But for non-healthcare workers, for our viewers,
for non-healthcare workers, you have had an exposure, you isolate yourself, you quarantine yourself, remain indoors, and do the test. Now, as I said, rapid antigen test you can do as soon as 1 day after exposure. But if it is negative, then you repeat it after 48 hours. 5th day is the ideal time. If it is still negative and you are asymptomatic, then you can come out of your quarantine and sort of work and get back to normalcy. If you are symptomatic, then as Dr. Chatterjee said, you need to isolate if you are mild to moderate for a minimum period of 7 days, of which the last 3 days you should be without fever. So those guidelines that remain the same.
Guidelines have been revised on 5th of January. So at home, someone is exposed. If he's asymptomatic, he need not be tested. So that is what has been revised on the 5th of January document.
Yeah.
So Dr. Juneja, we use isolation and quarantine sometimes interchangeably, very commonly. And I would, in one line, if you can explain the difference between isolation and quarantine, number one. Number two, the importance of doing a second test to come out of isolation or quarantine. What is your opinion on that?
So simply isolation means that you have the disease, you are infected, and you need to isolate. Quarantine is that you do not have the disease, but you have been exposed to someone and you may develop the disease. That's why you need to take precautions. That is isolation and quarantine. A repeat test as of now has been done away. For mild asymptomatic patients have been done away and has been nicely explained. So if moderate severe, obviously yes, repeat test till the guidelines change, it will stand the same. The repeat test at discharge from hospital in severe cases, but in mild home isolation, no repeat test is required. And those who are on quarantine, if they remain asymptomatic, no tests are required as per latest guidelines.
Great. So, but if you want to know, or if you're exposed, if you have other people who could be at risk in your immediate environment, you may want to do a test. Nothing wrong with that, but it's not mandatory, right? That's what you're saying. Yeah. So last, I think we've reached we exhausted our time that was allotted to us. The last comment by Dr. Chatterjee. This is a speculative comment. Now, we all talk about lung involvement not being so prominent in Omicron, but we don't know anything about clotting involvements and so many other systemic involvements that were described one after the other in the earlier two waves. So we don't know much about that as far as Omicron is concerned. And we also don't obviously know as yet about what to expect. Long COVID is another story altogether. So what about non-respiratory involvement and long COVID? Chances with Omicron?
It's still quite early into this variant, and we really haven't reached the stage of long COVID, at least in our country. But what we are seeing is that the disease improves in 3 to 5 days' time. And even if I have done tests in people, just for my sake, in people who were at higher risk, I have done the inflammatory markers, I have done the D-dimer and all that, just to see for myself as well. Most of the reports have come out to be essentially normal in most of the people. So we have to really keep our fingers crossed about this long COVID thing, which we saw so much during the Delta variant, where we saw cardiac involvement, we saw neurological involvement, we obviously saw diabetes worsening, we saw mental fogging, and very minor symptoms like even weakness and muscle pains, which also lasted for a long time. This we haven't seen also, but till there is time, we are too early into this variant. Only time would tell us as to long COVID, whether it exists or not. But at least till now, it doesn't look that common that it will be a major manifestation, what we saw in Delta variant.
And clotting disorders too. Clotting disorders, we are not seeing so much, right?
Not seeing so much. Till now, it is.
Right. So I think we've run out of time. If anyone wants to make an important point that has been missed, which is very important for our viewers, I think we've got a wealth of information that will help our viewers tackle this disease. मेरे ख्याल से आपने ये ध्यान से सुना होगा कि हमारे साथियों ने क्या बताया आपको. कोई डरना नहीं है, लेकिन ओमिक्रॉन सिर्फ खांसी जुकाम भी नहीं है, ना ओमिक्रॉन कोई वैक्सीन है जिससे आप परमानेंटली इम्यून हो जाएंगे. ये भी हो सकता है कि आपको अभी ओमिक्रॉन हो, नेक्स्ट टाइम दूसरा वेरिएंट आए. ये सोचना कि इन्फेक्शन वैक्सीन से बेटर है, ये हमेशा गलत है. वैक्सीन जरूर लीजिए, और अगर ओमिक्रॉन से बचने की कोशिश कीजिए. अगर होता है तो उसका सही तरह से इलाज करिए. जरूरत से ज्यादा दवाइयां लेने से आपका कोई विशेष लाभ नहीं होगा, पर प्रिकॉशन लेना बहुत जरूरी है. और एक चीज जो हर इन्फेक्शन से, हर वेरिएंट से बचाती है, वो है मास्किंग. Proper masking and proper distancing will remain the mainstay of preventing future pandemics. Thank you very much.